The girl would have died in that alley if Hollis Brennan had walked 10 steps faster, but she stopped. Almost 1 a.m, behind the Halloran Tower, Chicago's February cold bit through her thin coat as if it had teeth. Hollis had just finished her second-floor mopping shift, her hands cracked from cleaning solvent, a few loose coins, and a box of leftover food in her pocket breakfast for the 5-year-old daughter asleep back home. For a woman walking alone at that hour, the only rule of survival was simple: don't stop. Then she heard it. A breath, broken, rasping. Behind the row of trash bins, a girl lay curled on the wet concrete, 18, 19 at most. So thin the coat hung off her like it was draped on a rack. Her cheeks burned red with fever, but her lips had already turned the color of ash. Hollis dropped to her knees, pressed a hand to the girl's forehead, and jerked it back, hot as forged iron. This one wouldn't last until morning. "Hey, can you hear me?" A groan, eyelids twitching. They didn't open. As Hollis slid an arm under her to lift her, she froze. The girl's right hand was clenched around. Something clenched so hard the knuckles had gone white, the grip of someone who would rather pass out than let go. Hollis pried the stiff fingers loose one by one. A scrap of paper unfolded, crumpled and damp. She turned it toward the dying yellow light at the end of the alley. 3 words. The strokes pressed deep, jagged, as if written by a hand trembling because the whole world had just collapsed. Not of the same blood. Hollis didn't understand what it meant. She didn't know that the name this girl was about to whisper in her fever was a name that made the coldest men in Chicago lower their voices. She knew only one thing, by the stubborn instinct of a mother. There was a child fading away at her feet, and she could not walk past. She took off her only coat, wrapped it around the girl, and lifted her onto her back. She had no idea she had just bent down to carry an entire storm, the kind of storm the most powerful people in this city, if they were wise, would choose to stand far away from. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and share it to spread a little kindness. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the heartfelt journeys still to come. The road home felt longer than any night Hollis had ever walked. The girl on her back was weightless, so light it was frightening, as though that body had forgotten how to hold on to its own heaviness. The child's breath brushed against the back of Hollis's neck, burning hot one moment and broken the next, each fragile rhythm a reminder that time was running out. Hollis clung to the rusted iron railing of the old apartment building, climbing one pitch-dark step at a time, counting silently in her head so she wouldn't fall. The 3rd floor, door number 14. She pushed it open with her shoulder because both her hands were busy holding the girl in place. The apartment had only one room, with a tiny kitchen pressed close to the bed, and the familiar smell of dampness clung to the walls. But tonight, to the person breathing faintly against her back, it was the warmest place in the world. Hollis laid the girl down on her own bed, pulled the thin blanket over her, then hurriedly knocked 3 times on the wall separating her room from the one next door. Mrs. Marguerite had lived there for many years. She had once been a nurse, before her legs no longer allowed her to stand through entire shifts. 3 knocks were all she needed to understand that something was wrong. She came over in her nightrobe, her silver hair hastily twisted into a bun, and with just one glance, the color of her face changed. She placed the back of her hand against the girl's forehead, then against her neck, and shook her head softly. "The child's fever is far too high, Hollis. Get me a towel and a basin of cool water." Hollis did as she was told, her hands trembling, and not because of the cold. "Mrs." Marguerite wrung out the towel and wiped the girl's forehead, her neck, and her thin, bony arms with the practiced movements of someone who had done this thousands of times before. She told Hollis to mix a little warm sugar water and feed it by tiny spoonfuls into the cracked corner of the girl's mouth. "What kind of child ends up like this?" she muttered, with no one out looking for her. While the 2 women bent over the strange girl, caring for her, a tiny foot touched the floor. Posy, Hollis's 5-year-old daughter, rubbed her eyes as she stepped out from the corner where her little bed stood, her messy hair sticking up in every direction. She didn't cry, and she didn't look afraid. She only stared at the unfamiliar older girl lying half unconscious with wide, wondering eyes. "Mama, is she sick?" "Yes, she's very sick. Go back to sleep, sweetheart." But Posy didn't return to bed. She ran to the corner of the room and carried out the little cotton blanket printed with stars, the one she hugged every night, the warmest thing she owned. Then she tiptoed over and laid the blanket on the girl, smoothing it carefully with her tiny hands, looking as solemn as if she were doing something terribly important. "You can use this so you'll be warm." Hollis stopped moving, her throat tightening. In this room that held nothing of value, her child had just given away the only thing she considered a treasure. Mrs. Marguerite looked up too, her eyes softening, and gently stroked Posey's head. "You're a good girl, but now let her rest. Come back to bed with your mother." Posey nodded. But before she went, she took the girl's limp hand, the hand still marked with the indentation of something that had once been clutched too tightly, and squeezed it softly, as though she were passing along a little of her own childish warmth. The night crawled by slowly. The fever reached its worst point around 3 o'clock in the morning, then finally began to ease under the cool towels and Mrs. Marguerite's patient hands. The girl remained delirious, murmuring sounds no one could understand, her head shifting faintly on the pillow, as if she were trying to run from something inside her dreams. Hollis sat beside her, not daring to leave, listening to every broken phrase that escaped those dry lips. Most of it was only moaning, but at one moment, in the deepest part of the fever, the girl suddenly gripped the edge of the blanket, tears leaking from the corners of her closed eyes, and one name broke out of her, very softly, yet so clearly that Hollis felt a chill pass down her spine. "Sully, don't leave me." Hollis frowned. She had never heard that name before. She didn't know who it belonged to, and she didn't know why a girl abandoned in an alley and nearly left to die would call it with such desperate tenderness in the middle of a fever dream. All she knew was that, looking at that young face soaked in sweat, this child was running from something far larger than a fever. And in the dark room near dawn, Hollis found herself wondering who this girl really was. The girl woke just as the gray light of early morning slipped through the gap in the curtains. In the first instant she opened her eyes, she didn't know where she was. An unfamiliar ceiling, an unfamiliar smell, an unfamiliar blanket printed with stars covering her body. And her first instinct wasn't relief, but terror. She bolted upright too fast, her head spinning, her back striking the wall, both hands flailing wildly as if she were trying to shove the whole world away. Her eyes went wide, sweeping across the room in search of an escape, stopping at the door, and at once she threw off the blanket, ready to run toward it. Don't run. You've just come through a bad sickness." Hollis, who had been sitting in the kitchen corner making milk for Posey, quickly set the cup down and raised both hands in front of her chest, palms facing outward, the gesture of someone trying to say, "I'm not holding anything. I won't hurt you." But the girl didn't listen. She had only managed to rise halfway before her legs buckled beneath her body still far too weak after the fever, and she collapsed back onto the edge of the bed, gasping for breath, trembling all over. Hollis didn't move closer. She understood that with a wounded animal, the nearer you came, the more frightened it became, so she only stayed where she was, lowering her voice until it was very soft and very slow, the same voice she used to soothe Posey whenever the child had nightmares. "No one here is going to hurt you. This is my home. Last night I found you lying in the alley with a terrible fever, so I brought you back. That's all. You're safe." The girl stared at her, her chest still rising and falling hard, and the look in her eyes was something Hollis would never forget, the look of someone who had been emptied of everything she had once trusted, someone who no longer knew whom to believe, no longer dared to believe in anything at all. Those eyes were far too old for a face still so young. It took a long while before the girl realized no hand was reaching out to seize her, no voice was shouting, nothing was there except a strange woman with cracked hands, waiting patiently. Only then did she begin to calm. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders sank, and with that loosening came tears, silent and soundless, rolling down cheeks that still carried the traces of fever. Hollis poured a cup of warm water, set it on the little stool, and gently pushed it toward her, close enough for the girl to reach, without Hollis having to come nearer. "Drink a little. Your throat must be terribly dry." The girl looked at the cup, hesitated, then picked it up with both hands still shaking and drank in small sips. "My name is Hollis, and that tiny little thing hiding behind me, staring at you because she's curious, is Posey, my daughter. She keeps asking what the sick girl's name is." Posey peeked out from behind her mother's legs and waved her tiny hand with a smile missing one front tooth. That innocence was like a small crack in the girl's wall of defense. She looked at the child, then down at the star-patterned blanket on her lap, and for the first time since waking, something softened at the corners of her eyes. "Win," she said, her voice hoarse from not having used it in so long. "My name is Win." Hollis waited, thinking there would be a last name too, but there wasn't. The girl stopped right there, and in that moment of hesitation, Hollis read something in her, something deliberate, a door being closed on purpose. Wynne didn't withhold her family name because she had forgotten it. She hid it, because that name carried things she didn't want to drag into this small, warm room, things she didn't want to pour onto the woman who had taken off her own coat in the middle of a winter night to save a stranger, things she didn't want to place over the head of the child who had given her the most precious blanket she owned. Some names are a greeting, some names are a sentence, and Wynne, curled up in the poor apartment of a good woman, chose to swallow her last name like a bitter pill, so she could keep these people safely outside the storm she knew would come looking sooner or later. About 10 kilometers from Hollis's Alley, in the southern Port District of Chicago, another world moved according to laws of its own. That morning, a sleek black car rolled slowly into the warehouse grounds, and the moment it came to a stop, it was as if someone had turned down every sound in the harbor. The workers carrying cargo suddenly slowed their hands. Men who had been talking lowered their voices. A few quietly pulled their caps farther down over their faces. Sullivan Castellano stepped out of the car in a dark charcoal wool coat, his stride unhurried, yet every step he took seemed to thicken the air around him. He was 31 years old, with a sharply cut face and the eyes of a man accustomed to watching others lower their heads. When he passed, people really did lower their heads, not out of courtesy, but from some ancient instinct warning them that there were certain men it was better not to look directly in the eye. Sully had come here today because of a small matter, at least to him it was small. A man named Royce, one of the men under Brett Maddox, had abused his authority. He was standing in the middle of the warehouse, waving his arms, shouting at a thin, stooped old warehouse keeper over money the old man didn't owe, a debt Royce had invented for his own pocket. The old man stood with his back bent and both hands clasped together, begging, while Royce sneered, savoring the taste of borrowed power. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him. He only realized something was wrong when the whole warehouse suddenly went silent, and the old man in front of him opened his eyes wide, staring over Royce's shoulder. Sully didn't shout. He never needed to shout. He simply stood there, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, and asked in a flat voice colder than the harbor wind, "Who gave you permission to collect money from one of my people?" Royce spun around, his face visibly draining of color. He stammered out an excuse, saying it was Brett's order, saying he was only following instructions. But the moment Brett's name slipped from his mouth, Sully's eyes narrowed slightly, just for an instant, like an animal catching a strange scent in the wind. He made no comment about that name. He only gave a faint lift of his chin, and at once 2 large men standing behind him stepped forward, seized Royce, and pinned him against the wall without needing to throw a single blow. Royce struggled, but in the hands of Sully's men, his strength was no different from a fish trapped in a net. "Give the old man his money back, apologize properly, then get out of my port before noon." Sully spoke without raising his voice, but every word fell like a slab of stone. "The next time you use my name to bully someone who can't fight back, you won't have any port left to stand in." He took out his phone, dialed a number, said a few short words, and within minutes, the news that Royce had been thrown out spread through the port faster than the sea wind. One call from him was enough to cut off a man's lifeline in this underworld. That was real power, the kind that didn't need to display itself. It only needed to exist. The old warehouse keeper bowed his trembling head in gratitude, and Sully merely gave a small nod, placed something in the old man's hand, then turned away. But when he returned to the car, that cold face showed its first crack of the morning. His driver and most trusted bodyguard, a quiet man named Hale, was waiting with a grave expression. "Still no news?" Sully asked, and this time his voice no longer held the chill of a man giving orders. It carried something very few people had ever heard in Sullivan Castellano's voice: urgency. Hale shook his head. "It's been 5 days. Wynne left the mansion without her phone, without $1 on her, without saying a word to anyone. The last camera caught her downtown. Then she disappeared completely." Sully clenched his fist inside his coat pocket. His sister, only 19 years old, the one person left in the world who could still make his hardened heart ache, had vanished into a vast and bitterly cold city, just when he could feel that something was rotting from within his own house. He looked out across the gray harbor water, and for the first time in many years, the man who made all of Chicago's underworld lower its voice felt a fear rising inside him that money and power could never bribe away. On the way back to the mansion, Sully leaned his head against the car seat, closed his eyes, and memory came flooding back like water breaking through a dam. the kind of memory he had buried carefully for many years, but had never truly been able to release. Back then, he was only 15 years old, a skinny boy standing in the winter courtyard of the villa, and outside the iron gate of the Castellano house, there was something that had sent all the servants into a commotion. A little girl, about 3 years old, dressed in thin clothes, sat curled inside a basket placed right in front of the gate. Her cheeks flushed red from the cold, her large eyes staring blankly at the people moving around her, not understanding why she had been left there. Sully's father, a powerful and practical man, had intended to call someone to take the child away and hand her over to some agency to deal with, because in the world he was building, there was no room for nameless burdens, rootless burdens, useless burdens that offered no advantage. But the teenage Sully did something even he couldn't explain. He stepped forward and lifted the child into his arms, feeling that tiny, trembling weight against him, and instead of crying, the child buried her face in his chest and went completely quiet, as though she had found the very thing she had been searching for. He turned to his father, and for the first time in his life, he dared to look straight into the eyes of the man the whole city feared, speaking in a voice that shook but refused to retreat. "I want to keep her." His father frowned and said she didn't have a drop of Castellano blood, that raising an unclaimed child would only invite trouble. And the boy Sully answered with a sentence he would still remember, word for word, many years later, a sentence that shaped the rest of his life. "Blood isn't something I get to choose, but keeping her or not is something I can choose, and I choose. She's my sister, because I want her to be." His father stayed silent for a very long time, looking at the son he was still trying to forge into a cold-blooded heir, and perhaps in that moment he realized that his child possessed something he himself had lost long ago. In the end, he waved his hand, a gesture that was both permission and surrender, and the little girl was allowed to stay. They named her Win. From that day on, Sully never saw Win as an adopted child. He saw her as his sister, in the fullest and most absolute meaning of the word. He was the one who taught her to ride a bicycle in the wide courtyard, the one who sat for hours in the hospital hallway whenever she was sick, the one who threatened into disappearance anyone who dared make her cry. In a world where he had to wear a cold mask in order to survive, Win was the only piece left of the man he might have become if life had turned down another road. She was living proof that his heart hadn't turned entirely to stone. And now, sitting in the car as it rolled through the cold gray streets, Sully was being strangled by a fear he had never admitted to anyone. It wasn't the fear of losing power. It wasn't the fear of enemies. It was the naked, ancient fear of someone who had once held a tiny life in his arms and sworn he would never let her be abandoned again. He had sworn that when he was 15 years old, and now Win was somewhere out there, alone, in the cold, just like the night he had found her outside the gate. Sully opened his eyes, his jaw clenched tight. He didn't know why she had left, didn't know what had made the girl who had always smiled at him suddenly vanish without a word. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would turn this entire city inside out to find her, and God help whoever had dared lay a hand on Sullivan Castellano's sister. By afternoon, when Posey had fallen asleep for her nap, and the apartment had settled into a rare kind of quiet, Win finally allowed herself to speak. She sat on the bed with her legs drawn up, the star-patterned blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on empty space, and the words slipped out in broken pieces, like shards being gathered one by one with great difficulty. Hollis didn't ask anything. She only sat down on the little stool a short distance away, both hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, quietly waiting, because she understood that some wounds only open when no one is forcing them to. "I used to think I knew exactly who I was," Win began, her voice so small it nearly disappeared beneath the groaning hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen corner. "I had a family. I had someone who always protected me. I never doubted that, not for a single second." She stopped, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket, her knuckles turning white, exactly the way she had once clutched that scrap of paper in the alley. "Then last week, I found something. In the old study of the father who had passed away, there was a locked drawer no one had opened since the day he died. It was only by accident. I was looking for an old photograph, but what I pulled out wasn't a photograph. It was a file that had turned yellow with age, the edges worn and frayed, and on it was my name, the date I was brought home, along with lines of writing I read over and over, until I knew them by heart, even though I wish I'd never seen them at all. An adoption file. Win closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were already red. It turns out I wasn't their blood. It turns out my whole life was something that had been picked up, a nameless child left somewhere, then brought into a family I had always believed was mine by birth. Everything I trusted, every embrace, every time I called someone brother and someone called me sister, suddenly felt like a sandcastle the tide had just washed flat. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know whether the love people gave me was real, or whether it was only pity stretched out over more than 10 years. Hollis listened, and something inside her ached, because she understood how deeply the fear of being abandoned could gnaw at a person. I was so scared, Wynne whispered. I didn't dare face him. I was afraid to look into his eyes and see the truth, that I had never truly belonged there. So I ran. I didn't take anything with me. No phone, no money. I only grabbed that yellowed file and ran out the door, kept running until my legs wouldn't listen to me anymore. She reached into the pocket of the coat hanging over the edge of the bed and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper Hollis had pried from her hand in the alley, the paper bearing those 3 fateful words. I hate it, Wynne said, her voice breaking. I hate this thing. It ruined everything. And in her agitation, she reached out with both hands, ready to tear it into 100 pieces, as though destroying the paper could also destroy the truth. But Hollis reached her in time, her cracked hand gently closing around Wynne's wrist to stop her. Wait, she said softly but firmly. Don't tear it. Wynne looked up, her eyes wet with tears, not understanding. I know it hurts you, Hollis went on. But once papers like this are gone, they're gone for good. You're panicking right now, and when people panic, they easily throw away things they may need later. Maybe one day you'll want to understand the whole story. Want to know where you really came from. When that day comes, this may be the only clue. Let me keep it for you. I'll put it somewhere safe. Whenever you're ready, it'll still be there waiting for you. Wynne looked at the strange woman holding her hand, a woman who owed her nothing and yet was thinking so far ahead for her, and after a long moment of hesitation, she gave a small nod and let go of the paper. Hollis folded it carefully, placed it inside her old notebook, and tucked it away in a drawer, never knowing that she had just kept in her hands the very thing that would one day change all their fates. While Sully was nearly going mad because he couldn't find a single lead, there was one person inside his empire who knew exactly where Wynne was, and that person was the very man he trusted with the task of finding her. Brett Maddox had served under the Castellano family for nearly 20 years, climbing slowly from a low-level errand man to the right-hand man who held the organization's entire information network in his grasp, from eyes and ears on the streets to the surveillance camera system spread across the city. That was why, when Sully ordered every resource mobilized to search for his sister, Brett was the first man to touch the data, and also the first man to see the crucial footage. Sitting alone in a dark room, dimly lit by the glow of the monitor, he rewound and replayed the images from a traffic camera near Halloran Tower, and there, clear as day, was the sight of a thin woman carrying a girl on her back before disappearing into a dark alley. Brett zoomed in on the woman's face, cross-checked it, and within a few hours he had every piece of information on Hollis Brennan, a single mother who worked the night shift as a janitor, lived in an old apartment building on the west side of the city, had no powerful relatives, and had no one backing her. Perfect prey. If he had been a loyal subordinate, Brett would have reported to Sully at once, and Wynne would have been brought home that very night. But Brett wasn't loyal. He sat there for a long time, his finger tapping a steady rhythm on the tabletop, while in his mind, a plan that had already begun taking shape now started locking into place, piece by piece, because the one who had pushed Wynne to the breaking point and made her run from home was none other than him. For many months, Brett had been quietly feeding his ambition to seize Sully's position, to take control of the entire empire he believed he had spent his youth helping build, but would never be allowed to lead. The greatest obstacle wasn't Sully's strength. It was the thing that made Sully human, the only weakness he had, and that was Wynne. As long as Wynne existed, Sully had a reason to live, something to protect, a heart that hadn't turned to stone. And Brett understood that if a man wanted to bring down an alpha wolf, he didn't always need to face it head-on. Sometimes he only needed to take away the thing that still made it capable of softness. Brett himself was the one who had searched through the old study of Sully's late father, found the adoption file that had been locked away for so many years, and instead of destroying it, he had arranged everything with careful precision so that Wynne would stumble upon it by accident at the exact moment she was alone, He had calculated every move. He knew how a 19-year-old girl, who believed she belonged to a home, would collapse when she suddenly discovered that her entire identity was a lie. He knew how she would panic, and that she would very likely run. Once Wynne disappeared from Sully's protection, he could make her vanish forever, blame it on some outside enemy, and a broken Sully would be a Sully far easier to overthrow. Everything had gone almost exactly according to the script, except for one variable Brett hadn't foreseen: a kind woman who happened to pass through the alley and saved the girl. Now Wynne was still alive, still in a place only he knew about, and that was both a risk and an opportunity. Brett smiled coldly in the darkness, turned off the monitor, and wiped the footage from the system so no one else could trace it. Then he picked up the phone and called Sully, and with the falsely worried voice of a devoted subordinate, he reported that every lead had gone cold, that there were signs Wynne had fallen into the hands of some hostile force, and that he was pouring all his strength into the investigation. Every word he spoke was coated in sugar and laced with poison. Every piece of information was twisted just enough to lead Sully in the wrong direction. On the other end of the line, Sully listened to the brother he trusted most, completely unaware that the sharpest knife pressed against his back was held in the very hand he still gripped whenever he needed something to lean on. Brett couldn't carry out the whole plan alone, because he needed a pair of dirty hands that couldn't be tied directly to the Maddox name, someone who could make a person disappear without leaving behind any trail that led back to him. And he knew exactly whom to find. That evening, in a discreet bar on the edge of the city, where the lights were always dim and conversations were always carried out in whispers, Brett met Cordelia Vance. She ran an underground network that specialized in hunting down people with nowhere to hold on to. Young, lost souls with no family, no one searching for them, no one to raise a voice when they vanished. She called it work, a cold trade built on other people's despair. And in Chicago's underworld, the name Cordelia Vance was tied to those who left and never came back. She sat across from Brett, her hair neatly pinned up, wearing the calm smile of a dealer long used to bargaining over things that should never be placed on the table. Brett laid out his demand without circling around it. "There is a girl," he said, 19 years old, currently hiding in an apartment in an old building on the west side of the city, taken in by a single mother named Hollis Brennan. He needed that girl to disappear, cleanly, without a trace, and he needed it done soon. Cordelia lifted an eyebrow and asked whether the girl had anyone behind her, whether anyone would tear the city apart looking for her. Brett smiled, a calculating smile, and told a half-lie, saying the girl was only a runaway, no longer claimed by anyone, with nothing left to lose. He carefully kept the Castellano name out of it, because if Cordelia knew the girl was Sully's sister, even someone as reckless as she was wouldn't dare touch her. But the most cunning part of Brett's plan didn't lie in getting rid of Wynne. It lay in the woman who had saved her. To Brett, Hollis Brennan wasn't only a variable that needed to be removed. She was also the perfect pawn to take the blame. He laid out every step for Cordelia. First, her network would quietly create false traces, making it look as if Hollis had already been connected to Cordelia's operation, as if Hollis herself had lured Wynne back to that apartment in order to hand the girl over to traffickers. A few bought witnesses would claim they had seen Hollis lingering near places where Cordelia operated. A few items would be planted, and once every false piece had fallen into place, Brett would personally bring that information to Sully's ear, though of course it would be a distorted version, a story in which Hollis wasn't a savior, but an accomplice. Not the woman who had rescued Wynne, but the one holding her for dark and calculated purposes. That way, when Sully found that apartment, he wouldn't see a kind woman. He would see an enemy. And in the fury of a brother who believed his sister had been abducted, Sully might very well strike Hollis down himself before he had time to hear a single explanation. One arrow, many targets. Wynne would disappear through Cordelia's hands. Hollis would become the one condemned for it, and Sully would stain his own hands with the blood of an innocent woman, only to collapse afterward beneath the weight of realizing how wrong he had been, weak enough and lost enough for Brett to move in and take everything. Cordelia listened, tapping her fingernails against the side of her glass, then sealed the matter with a price. She didn't care about Brett's hunger for power. She cared only about her share. Two cold-blooded people shook hands in the dim light of the bar, a handshake with no trust in it at all, only self-interest binding them together, but dangerous enough to place the lives of two innocent women on the scales. Outside, the city still shone brightly and carelessly, unaware that somewhere in a dark corner, a trap had just been set. and its threads were quietly crawling toward the small apartment where Hollis was rocking her daughter to sleep. Brett's machine of lies began running smoothly in only 2 days. Cordelia's network worked quietly and efficiently, building around Hollis Brennan a thin shell of guilt, but one sealed tightly enough that no one would rush to peel it apart. One bribed man claimed he had once seen Hollis exchanging something with Cordelia's people on a dark street corner. One carefully manipulated photograph showed her standing near a place where Cordelia's operation was known to come and go. A few fake messages were planted on a burner phone and then tied to her, their wording vague, but enough for people to infer that she was holding a young girl for a purpose that couldn't possibly be good. Brett didn't choose anything crude, like inventing a ransom demand, because he understood far too well that a demand for money was the easiest thing to verify. One traced call would expose it. Instead, he chose something much harder to disprove. He turned Hollis into a link in Cordelia's trafficking ring, someone who lured and detained lost girls. That accusation didn't need clear proof. It only needed to plant suspicion. And once suspicion had taken root in the mind of a man going mad with fear for his sister, it would grow on its own into belief. When every false piece had fallen into place, Brett came to Sully with the face of a man carrying terrible news and a heavy heart. He said there had finally been a breakthrough, that his people had traced Wynn's trail, but the truth was more horrifying than they had imagined. "Your sister," he said, lowering his voice, "didn't just run away and wander the streets. She fell into the hands of a ring that preys on lonely young girls. And the person directly holding her is a woman named Hollis Brennan, a janitor living in an old apartment building on the west side. Someone who looks poor and harmless on the outside, but is actually working for them." Brett pulled out the file he had prepared and spread it before Sully. One photograph, one statement, one carefully arranged fragment of information after another, all put together so skillfully that even a clear-headed man would have wavered. He watched every line of Sully's face as Sully looked at those things, and he knew his poison was taking effect. Unlike the gnawing worry that had been eating at him for days, the emotion rising in Sully now was a cold rage, the kind of anger that didn't explode noisily, but froze solid, sharp as a blade fresh from the forge, and plunged straight into ice. He looked at the photograph of that thin woman, and in his mind he imagined his sister, the girl he had sworn to protect since he was 15 years old, being imprisoned, being treated like merchandise in the hands of cold-blooded people. The vein at his temple pulsed. His fingers tightened on the edge of the table until the wood gave a faint groan. "Where is she?" Sully asked, his voice terrifyingly soft. The kind of voice the men under him had learned was even more dangerous than a roar. Brett handed over the address, secretly rejoicing behind his deeply concerned expression, because everything was unfolding exactly as he had drawn it in the dark. He also added a few careful words that sounded like advice, saying Sully should act quickly and decisively before the prey had time to run, saying that with a person like her, there was no need to waste words. Every sentence he spoke was a small push, pushing Sully toward the edge Brett had already dug for him, the place where Sully would strike an innocent woman and shatter his own conscience with his own hands. Sully stood, put on his coat, and in his eyes there was no longer any trace of the warmth that had once belonged to the older brother who had held a child against his chest. There was only the absolute coldness of a wolf about to rush out and reclaim what belonged to him, completely unaware that the man who had just pointed the way was the real wolf, and that the address in his hand didn't lead to an enemy's den, but to the home of the kindest woman his sister had ever met. In the small apartment on the west side of the city, the days passed with a warmth that neither Hollis nor Wynn had expected. The girl who had once curled in on herself with fear had begun to smile, even if they were only fleeting smiles, and most of it was because of Posey. The 5-year-old child clung to Wynn as though she had found the older sister she had always longed for, pulling her down to the floor to play at folding colored scraps of paper into animal shapes, chattering to her about every little thing with no beginning and no end, about her teacher, about the stray cat in the courtyard, about the dream she had had the night before. At first, Wynn only sat and listened, but little by little she was drawn into that innocence, and once Hollis caught her crawling across the floor with Posey, both of them giggling because a paper rabbit had been folded crooked and looked more like a mouse. In the evenings, the three of them shared a humble meal made from the cheap things Hollis could afford. But the air around the old table was filled with something money couldn't buy. Wynn began to speak more, not about her pain, but about small things, about the cake she liked, about the songs she used to hum. Once, after Posey had fallen asleep, She softly told Hollis that this was the first time in a very long while that she felt she was being seen as a person, not as a position, an identity, or a piece in someone else's calculation. Hollis only smiled, gently stroked the girl's hair, and said that here, she didn't need to be anyone at all. She only needed to be herself. But between those tender moments, a sense of unease kept slipping into Hollis's heart like cold mist seeping through a crack in the door. It began with very small things. The woman who ran the grocery at the mouth of the alley told her that a few strangers had come asking about a single mother who worked as a janitor and lived around there, asking too carefully, too persistently. A man she had never seen before kept lingering across the street in the afternoons, his eyes fixed on the third-floor window of her apartment, then disappearing whenever she looked back. One morning, she found marks on the lock of the shared hallway, as if someone had tried to force it open. Taken separately, none of those things meant much. But together, the instinct of a mother who had grown used to living with danger waiting nearby told her that something was wrong, that some unseen thing was closing in around her little nest. She began to notice how Wynne grew tense whenever strange footsteps sounded in the hallway, how the girl avoided the window, and she wondered whether the family name Wynne had tried so hard to hide had anything to do with the shadows now watching them. One night, as she stood by the window and looked down at the empty street, she saw that familiar silhouette again, this time standing longer, more patiently, like an animal waiting for the right moment. Hollis pulled the curtain shut, her heart pounding, and for the first time she seriously thought about sending Posey over to Mrs. Marguerite's place for a few days, just to keep her safe. She gathered her sleeping daughter into her arms, breathed in the familiar scent of the child's hair, and made a silent promise that no matter what happened, she wouldn't let anyone harm the children under this roof. She didn't know who the person standing down in the street was, didn't know why they had come, didn't know that in only a few hours, a force beyond anything she could imagine would come knocking at her door. She only knew, in the way people who had survived too much loss could still sense things, that this fragile peace was about to be broken, and she held her daughter a little tighter, as though trying to keep a few final moments of those quiet days from slipping away. The knock came close to 11 o'clock at night, 3 slow, decisive raps, not the kind of knocking that belonged to a neighbor or a delivery man. Hollis had just soothed Posey to sleep in the small room inside, pulling the door nearly shut so the child wouldn't be woken by any noise outside, and only then did she step out. Her heart tightened when she looked through the crack of the door. 2 men were standing in the dark hallway, and though she had never met them before, she understood at once that the shadows lingering around the building these past few days had only been the prelude to this moment. She glanced toward Wynne and saw the girl standing frozen in the middle of the room, her face drained of every trace of color, and that reaction alone told Hollis that the men outside were connected to the past Wynne was running from. When Hollis opened the door a little, Sully stepped inside, followed by a calm man with sharp, watchful eyes named Dale Renner. Sully had deliberately chosen not to bring a crowd with him, partly because he didn't want to stir up the whole apartment building, and partly because deep down, even with anger boiling inside him, he still kept the habit of a man who always wanted to see his prey clearly with his own eyes before striking. He didn't need an army to frighten a thin woman. His presence alone, the way his tall frame filled the narrow doorway in that dark coat, the way his cold stare seemed capable of freezing the entire room, was already more than enough. "This woman has been holding my sister," Sully said, his voice low and flat enough to send a chill through the bones. Not a question, but a verdict already handed down. Hollis took half a step back, both hands clenching together, but she didn't run, and she didn't scream. She stood between the 2 strange men and the door to the room where her daughter was sleeping, guided by the instinct of a mother animal. "I don't understand what you're talking about," she answered, her voice trembling but trying to stay steady. "I'm not holding anyone." Sully stepped farther inside, his eyes sweeping across the shabby apartment, and somewhere in his mind, the image Brett had planted there, the image of a trafficker's hideout, began to collide with what his eyes were actually seeing. "Don't act," he said, anger hardening his voice. "I've been told everything. You work for a ring that captures girls like my sister. You lured her here." Hollis heard those words and went dizzy, her mouth opening to argue. But no words came out, because the accusation was so terrible and so absurd that she didn't even know where to begin defending herself. It was at that very moment that Wynne rushed forward, forcing herself between Hollis and Sully, both arms spread as though to shield the woman who had saved her. "It's not true, Sully," the girl cried, tears streaming down her face. She didn't do anything. She saved me. That voice, that face, stopped Sully as if someone had struck him in the chest. For one instant, the older brother inside the cold wolf rose to the surface, and he almost stepped forward to pull his sister into his arms. But then the reason Brett had poisoned dragged him back. "She's manipulated you, Wynne," he said, his eyes still pinned on Hollis with suspicion. "People like her are best at pretending to be good." The room sank into a thick, suffocating tension. 3 people standing there with 3 different truths in their minds. Sully with a lie he believed was real, Hollis with a truth she had no way to prove, and Wynne trapped between them, knowing the truth clearly but powerless to move the brother whose eyes had been covered. Dale Renner, who had been standing silently and observing with a professional eye, lightly touched Sully's shoulder and said in a low voice that something didn't fit here, that this place didn't look like any trafficking location he had ever known. But Sully was trapped inside a storm of his own, and in the inner room, behind the closed door, Posey was still sleeping deeply, completely unaware that only a few steps away, the fate of her mother, herself, and the new older sister she had just found was hanging by a fragile thread between misunderstanding and truth. Dale's words slipped like a grain of sand into the machine spinning wildly inside Sully's head, forcing him, however unwillingly, to truly begin looking. And the more he looked, the more what he saw failed to match the story Brett had drawn for him. A den of human traffickers, by all ordinary logic, should have had reinforced doors, signs of guards, signs of dirty money. But this place was only a cramped apartment with peeling paint on the walls, an old refrigerator groaning in the corner, and a few worn pieces of furniture kept with such care it was almost heartbreaking. On the table sat a pot of thin soup that was still warm, divided into 3 uneven portions, and the smallest portion, he realized, had been placed at the woman's seat. There was no lock fastened to the outside of the bedroom door, nothing to show that Wynne had been held prisoner. On the contrary, his sister, though thinner and pale, was standing there shielding this woman with her whole body, and in her eyes there was none of the fear a victim would feel toward a captor, only the attachment of someone who had been taken in and cared for. Sully felt a small crack run down the wall of belief Brett had built inside him. He lowered his voice, and for the first time since stepping inside, he asked Wynne a question because he truly wanted to hear the answer. What had really happened? It was in that moment, just as the choking tension had begun to loosen, that the door to the inner room creaked open. Posey, awakened by the voices of the adults, rubbed her eyes and stepped out, her hair messy, her hand still clutching the paper rabbit Wynne had folded for her. The child wasn't afraid at all, because to a child's eyes, the tall man standing in the middle of the room was only an unfamiliar visitor. She looked at Sully with curiosity, then asked innocently whether he was the Sully that Wynne had been crying out for in her bad dreams. That innocent question made the whole room fall still. Sully looked down at the little girl, and something in his chest suddenly softened. The child, not understanding the gravity of the situation, simply kept chattering, saying that Wynne had been terribly sick when her mother carried her home, that her mother had stayed awake through several nights wiping her fever down, that her mother always gave Wynne the best part of the food while eating only a little herself, that every night her mother sang lullabies so Wynne could sleep and feel less feverish, the same song her mother always sang to her. Each clear sentence from the 5-year-old child struck like a hammer, breaking apart piece after piece of the false story Sully had swallowed whole. A trafficker didn't stay awake all night cooling the fever of her prey. A captor didn't give the best bite of food to the person she meant to sell. A cold-blooded accomplice didn't sing a prisoner to sleep with the same lullaby she used for her own daughter. That bare and simple truth, spoken from the mouth of a child who didn't know how to lie, carried more weight than every false piece of evidence Brett had worked so hard to arrange. Sully lifted his eyes to Hollis, the woman still standing there with her cracked hands clenched tight, not begging, not giving long explanations, only silently enduring his suspicious stare because she had no other way to protect herself. And he realized he had almost done something terrible. He had almost struck the woman who had saved his sister's life, only because he had believed the words of a man he should have suspected long ago. A cold question began to rise inside Sully's mind, pushing back the anger from before. If Hollis wasn't the villain, if all the evidence had been staged, then who had built all of it? Who had pushed that false information into his ear? Who had wanted him to destroy an innocent woman with his own hands and drive his sister toward death? He turned to Dale, and in the eyes of 2 men who had lived through too much, a name not yet spoken began to take shape in the silence. Posey, not knowing she had just changed the course of everything, yawned and reached out for her mother to hold her, and Hollis bent down to gather the child into her arms, daring for the first time after many breathless minutes to breathe out. After Posey had been carried back into the room by Hollis and laid down again, only 4 adults remained in the outer room, and the air had changed completely. Sully turned to Wynne, and this time, he was no longer looking at her with the eyes of a man who believed a story already built for him, but with the eyes of an older brother who wanted to hear the truth from his sister's own mouth. "Tell me," he said, his voice much gentler now, "everything from the beginning." Wynne drew in a trembling breath, then told him everything without avoiding any part of it: why she had run away from home, how panicked she had been, how Hollis had found her nearly exhausted and brought her back to care for her without knowing who she was, without asking for anything, without interrogating her even once. Every word she spoke completely denied the story Brett had laid before him, and Sully listened in silence as each piece in his mind slowly turned back into its rightful place. To prove what she was saying, Wynne looked at Hollis, and the woman understood. Hollis walked to the drawer, took out her old notebook, and from between its pages, she pulled the crumpled piece of paper she had stopped Wynne from tearing apart several days earlier, along with the yellowed file the girl had carried with her. She placed all of it in Sully's hands. "Wynne was going to throw it away," Hollis said softly, "but I thought one day she might need it." Sully took the file, and the moment his eyes touched it, his whole body went rigid. He didn't need to read every line carefully, because he knew too well what this was and where it had been kept. This was the most private document in the family, locked away by his late father inside a drawer in the old study, a room that almost no one had been allowed to enter since the day his father died. And it was at this point that Sully's sharp mind, which had been clouded by rage, began working again, coldly and precisely. He didn't question what was written on the paper, because to him, that had never been the issue. Wynne was his sister, no matter what that paper said. The question tearing through his mind now was something else, sharp as a knife. Who had gotten this out? Only a very small number of people were allowed inside that study. Only a very small number of people even knew that drawer existed, and for a file that had been locked away for years to suddenly fall into Wynne's hands, at the exact moment that would shatter her and make her run, couldn't possibly be an accident. There had to be a hand behind it, a hand on the inside, close enough to touch the deepest secrets of the family, powerful enough to access the system, and cruel enough to use Wynne's own pain as a weapon. Sully closed his eyes for 1 second, and when he opened them again, the scattered pieces of the past few days suddenly locked together into a picture so complete it was chilling. The man assigned to find Wynne who had somehow found no result, the man who had brought him the story about a trafficking ring and an innocent woman, the man who had pushed him here with rage boiling in his blood, advising him to act quickly and decisively, not to waste words. Every road led back to one single name, the name he had trusted for nearly 20 years, Brett. When that name became clear in his mind, the fury inside Sully was no longer the blazing fire that had burned when he believed his sister had been abducted. It became something else, colder, deeper, and far more dangerous. The anger of a man who had just discovered that the knife in his back was being held by the very hand he had once called a brother. He tightened his grip on the file until his knuckles turned white. Dale, standing beside him, looked at his friend's face and understood that everything had just turned onto a road from which there would be no return. Sully lifted his eyes to Hollis, the woman he had almost turned into a victim, and in his gaze there was no longer suspicion, only a silent remorse and a promise not yet spoken aloud. He had found the real enemy, and that enemy, all this time, had been standing right beside him, smiling. Sully wasn't a man who acted on blind anger, and that was why he had survived and remained standing for so many years in a world that devoured its own. Instead of rushing off to find Brett and pour out his fury, he sat down in the old chair inside Hollis's apartment, and together with Dale Renner, the friend and detective he trusted most, he began to weave a trap. The principle was very simple. To catch a cunning fox, you couldn't chase it. You had to make it walk into the net on its own, because it believed it was winning. Brett was still certain that his plan was unfolding smoothly, that Sully had come to this apartment burning with rage, and had very likely already struck against Hollis. Sully decided to make use of that very mistaken belief. He would let Brett think his trap had succeeded perfectly. The plan slowly took shape through careful discussion in the night. Sully would contact Brett and play the role of an older brother who was both grieving and exhausted, saying he had found Wynne but that she was in terrible condition, panicked and refusing to come home, and that he needed Brett to arrange a discreet place to bring her, somewhere safe and far from every pair of watching eyes. He knew exactly how Brett would react. Brett wouldn't be able to resist this opportunity, because personally obtaining Wynne's location was the final piece he needed to complete his scheme, and he would surely pull Cordelia Vance into it to deal with the girl. Dale added the crucial part, saying that to accuse both of them in a way they couldn't deny, they needed to let those two confess their crimes with their own mouths. They needed to record the moment Brett and Cordelia discussed eliminating Wynne and staging the blame against Hollis. The chosen location was an old warehouse in the Southern Port District, a place already under Sully's control, where he could arrange men and recording equipment in advance without Brett knowing a thing, because Brett still believed he was playing on home ground. While the two men calculated each step, Hollis, who should have been nothing more than an exonerated victim standing outside the matter, stepped forward and spoke. She placed the file and the crumpled paper on the table, and said something neither Sully nor Dale had thought of yet. She said that if the other man was clever enough to fabricate all that false evidence, then even a recorded confession could still be denied or blamed on someone else. But this was different. The original file taken from the family's locked drawer was physical proof that someone on the inside had broken into the most private place, and if they could find a way to prove Brett himself had touched it, then that would be the rope tying him tightly to the entire conspiracy, from leaking the secret to pushing Wynne to the edge. Sully looked at the woman before him with a mixture of surprise and respect. She had no power, no influence, nothing but calloused hands and an honest heart. Yet amid all the calculations of the underworld, she had seen the exact link that even he, in his rage, had missed. The fact that she had kept the paper Wynne once wanted to destroy, an act that had seemed so small, had now become the key card in this life and death game. The plan was settled in the final hours of the night. Wynne would be taken to a truly safe place under strict protection, and she absolutely wouldn't appear at the warehouse, so the girl would never have to set foot in danger. Posey would also be sent to Mrs. Marguerite's, far from every possible risk, and at the port, Sully would have the net ready and wait for the prey to walk in on its own. When the first rays of dawn slipped through the cracks of the small apartment door, every piece was already in place, and the man who had once been deceived was now ready to reverse the game, turning the traitor's trap into the very grave that would bury his ambition. The following night, the old warehouse in the Southern Port District sank beneath the sickly yellow glow of a few flickering bulbs, the air sharp with the smell of seawater and rusted iron. Brett arrived exactly at the appointed time, bringing Cordelia Vance and several of his men with him, completely convinced that he held the upper hand. He walked in with the posture of a man who had already won, his restless eyes searching for some sign of Wynne, and when he saw Sully standing alone in the middle of the warehouse, his back turned toward the stacks of cargo crates, his face drawn and exhausted, Brett became even more certain that the older brother had collapsed exactly as he had calculated. "Where is your sister?" Brett asked, his voice soaked in false concern. "You said you found her." Sully didn't turn around at once. He let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, then slowly turned, and when the light fell across his face, Brett knew instantly that something had gone wrong. There was no trace of a fallen man left in him. Sully's eyes were terrifyingly calm, the eyes of a hunter, not prey. "I keep wondering," Sully said, his voice flat, each word falling like drops of ice onto the concrete floor. "For nearly 20 years, I treated you like a brother. Was there ever even one day when you meant it?" The smile on Brett's face stiffened. He tried to salvage the moment, asking what Sully was talking about, but Sully had already lifted one hand, and from the shadows behind the crates, his men stepped out, quiet and decisive, closing into a circle around Brett and his crew. The position had been set long before Brett ever walked in, and only now did he understand that he wasn't standing on his own ground at all. He had walked straight into the very trap he thought was safe. "You arranged it well, Brett," Sully continued, taking one step closer with every word. "You got the file out of a drawer only a few people in this world even knew existed. You pushed my sister to the edge, then built a lie so I would kill an innocent woman with my own hands. You even calculated that I would break afterward, so you could swallow everything whole. There was only one thing you got wrong. You forgot that I know you better than you think." Cordelia, sensing danger, tried to retreat toward the door, but the exit had already been sealed by Sully's men. She hissed that she had nothing to do with any of this, that she was only doing business, but that panic itself betrayed her. Brett, backed into a corner, dropped the respectable mask and snarled in anger, admitting that everything would have been perfect if that janitor woman hadn't interfered, that he had grown sick of standing behind Sully for all these years and never being allowed to hold power. Every word he spat out in his rage fell into the recording devices Dale had hidden throughout the warehouse. Each confession another link tightening the noose around his throat. By the time Brett realized he had said too much, it was already too late. Sully gave a small nod, and his men immediately subdued Brett's crew, overwhelming them quickly and leaving them no chance to resist. There were a few sounds of shoving, a few brief struggles in the darkness of the warehouse, but the imbalance was too great, and within moments, Brett's entire side had been completely overpowered. Cordelia was held firmly in place, her once composed face now twisted with fear, her dark network collapsing in a single night. Brett stood in the middle of the circle, breathing hard, looking around and understanding that it was all over. "I could end you right here," Sully said, standing face to face with the traitor, and in that moment the whole warehouse seemed to hold its breath. "But I'm not giving you an easy way out. You're going to pay for every single thing you've done, publicly, in the way that frightens you most, by losing everything and living long enough to watch it happen." All of the confessions, along with the original file Hollis had kept as an undeniable link in the chain, would be handed over to the proper authorities to drag both of them into the light. Sully turned and walked away, leaving behind the man who had once been his right hand as he sank into the wreckage of his own ambition. And for the first time in many days, Sully's chest felt lighter, because his sister, somewhere safe far away from there, had finally truly escaped the darkness. What no one in the warehouse had foreseen was that Hollis was there too. Sully had brought her along to keep her under his direct protection, knowing her small apartment was no longer safe from Brett's remaining spies. Sully had arranged for her to stand in a safe, hidden corner outside the main area, under the watch of a trusted man, far from the confrontation. But in that chaotic instant when Sully's men subdued the others, Brett, with the survival instinct of an animal driven to the end of the road, didn't run toward the blocked main door. Instead, he suddenly lunged toward the woman he had briefly recognized at the edge of the warehouse, the person he hated most because she had ruined his perfect plan. Everything happened in only a few seconds. Brett caught Hollis by the arm and yanked her back against him, one arm locking tightly around her, turning her into a living shield between himself and the guns aimed at him. "Everyone back off," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation, his wild eyes darting around the room. "All of you back off, or this woman will pay for it." The entire warehouse froze at once. Sully's men stopped short. No one dared make a reckless move, because Hollis's life was now in the hands of a man with nothing left to lose. Hollis clutched the file tightly against her chest, her heart pounding. But even in her fear, she wasn't thinking of herself. She was thinking of Posey, of the silent promise she had whispered beside her daughter's ear, that she would come home. She wasn't allowed to fall here. Sully stood only a few steps away, and for the first time that night, the calm on his face cracked. He looked at the woman who had saved his sister, the woman he had nearly turned into a victim because of his own misplaced trust, now being shoved into danger right before his eyes, and something icy rose inside his chest. He raised one hand to signal his men to step back, lowered his voice, and spoke to Brett in a deliberately steady tone, trying to buy time and keep Brett's attention fixed on him. "Let her go, Brett. The one you hate is me, not her. Whatever you want, aim it at me." As he spoke, Sully's eyes flicked very quickly toward Hollis, a brief glance, but enough to send a message, telling her to stay calm and wait for the right opening. And Hollis, though trembling, understood. She felt Brett's grip loosening slightly, as his attention was pulled toward Sully, and in that moment of carelessness, she did the only thing she could. She gathered every ounce of strength she had, drove her elbow hard into his ribs, and dropped her body low, slipping out of his hold in a single heartbeat. That single heartbeat was all Sully needed. He sprang forward like an arrow leaving the bow, the few steps between them vanishing in a flash. And before Brett could react, Sully had him under control, slamming the traitor down onto the cold warehouse floor and pinning him in a position where he was completely helpless. Sully's men rushed in to help, stripping away Brett's final chance to resist. He lay there, pressed against the concrete, struggling weakly before going still, his face, once full of schemes, now showing only the collapse of a man who had lost everything. Sully helped Hollis to her feet, and for a moment, two people from two worlds that should never have met looked at each other without saying a word. Yet both understood that something had changed. The woman he had once coldly suspected had risked her own safety to protect the one thing that could bring the guilty into the light, and he, the man who had nearly harmed her, had rushed to save her without a second of hesitation. Grace and obligation, in that moment, had traded places and tangled together. The fragile woman he had thought needed protection turned out to be the bravest person in the room, and the cold, powerful man turned out to still know how to run toward a life that offered him no benefit at all. When everything at the port had come to an end, and the guilty had been taken away, Sully returned to the place where Wynne was being kept safe. She had stayed awake all night waiting, and the moment she saw him walk in unharmed, she rushed toward him, only to stop halfway, her arms falling helplessly to her sides, her eyes lowering, because now there was something standing between the two siblings, something she had carried inside her through all those days, the truth written in that old file. "I'm sorry," Wynne said, her voice choking, tears already on the verge of spilling over. "I ran away without saying a word to you. I found out I wasn't, that I'm not really—" She couldn't finish the sentence, because the thought alone was enough to break her open. "I was afraid that all these years you only loved me out of pity, that I had never truly belonged to this family." Sully stood still and listened to his sister, and when she finished, he didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, took the file Hollis had given back to him, the papers that had caused so much pain, and under Wynne's stunned gaze, he didn't open it to read. "Do you know what this is to me?" he said, his voice low and warm in a way very few people had ever heard from Sullivan Castellano. "It's only a piece of paper. It records something that happened more than 10 years ago. It says a little girl was brought into this house. That's all. It can't record the nights I sat in the hospital hallway when your fever was high. It can't record the way you clung to my shirt when you were learning to ride a bicycle. It can't record how many children I threatened just because they dared make you cry. None of those things are written on any piece of paper. They're here." He placed his hand over his chest. Wynne trembled, tears running down her face. "But blood," she whispered. "You and I don't share the same." Sully cut her off, gently but firmly. "Listen to me, and I'm only going to say this once, so you remember it for the rest of your life. The day I decided you were my sister, I was 15 years old, and I chose that not because of blood, but because I wanted to. A real family isn't something people simply inherit at birth. It's something people choose and protect every day. Papers only record what the heart signed a long time ago. Your Castellano name isn't inside this file. It's inside the more than 10 years I've seen you as my own flesh and blood. And no one, no piece of paper, can take that away from you unless you deny it yourself." Wynne burst into sobs, the kind of crying that no longer came from fear or despair, but from someone who had just been given back the thing she thought she had lost forever. She threw herself into his arms, and this time Sully didn't hesitate. He held his sister tightly, his arms closing around her exactly the way they had once closed around a trembling 3-year-old child outside the iron gate long ago. He rested his chin against her hair and softly told her he was sorry for nearly believing someone else's lies, sorry for leaving her to bear this pain alone for so long, and that from now on, no matter what the whole world said, she would always be his sister. From a distance, Hollis quietly watched the scene, and her own eyes blurred. She thought of Posey, of the way love between people had never needed a thread of blood to become sacred. In that silent room, between two people who had just found their way back to each other, a simple and profound truth appeared more clearly than ever. That family is not decided by blood, but woven by choice, by the courage to keep staying beside one another through every storm life brings. In the days after the incident at the port, everything slowly settled like the surface of a lake after a storm. Brett and Cordelia had to face the price for what they had done. Their dark network was dragged into the light, and for the first time in many months, Sully could breathe without feeling his back turn cold from a knife hidden behind friendly smiles. But there was one debt he knew he could never forget, and that was the debt he owed the woman who had saved his sister in the middle of a winter night, without asking for anything in return. Sully came to the small apartment on the west side of the city, but he didn't bring a suitcase full of money, the way powerful men often did when they wanted to repay a favor and wash their hands of it. He understood that placing a stack of cash in Hollis's hands would be no different from cheapening the very thing that made her precious. Instead, he sat down on the old chair in her apartment, spoke to her as an equal, and offered her things that could truly change the lives of mother and daughter. A decent and stable job, one worthy of her ability and kindness, so she would no longer have to scrub floors through the night and ask for leftover meal boxes. A safer, better place for Posey to grow up. And most important of all, he gave those things with respect, not pity, because he told her that she had taught even a man like him, a man who had thought he understood everything about the world, a lesson that all his years of power had never been able to teach him, that true kindness needs no condition, that it doesn't care about wealth or poverty, and that a person with nothing in her hands can still be richer than someone who holds an entire city. Hollis hesitated at first, because she had never been used to receiving, but she understood that this wasn't charity. It was recognition, a hand extended at eye level. That winter ended with a rare, warm afternoon. The apartment was now bright with laughter. Posey sat in the middle of the floor, folding paper animals with Wynne, the two girls giggling because a crooked giraffe looked more like a camel. Wynne now came often to visit the mother and daughter, calling Posey her little sister, and every time she stepped through the door, the child would cry out happily and run to throw her arms around her. Hollis stood in the kitchen making tea, watching the scene as warmth filled her heart, while Sully occasionally stopped by, the man who had once made all of Chicago's underworld lower its voice, now sitting on an old worn chair, drinking an ordinary cup of tea, and on that sharp, cold face there was finally room for a smile. 4 people from worlds that seemed as though they should never have crossed had become something like a family, not because of blood, not because of papers, but because they had chosen to stay beside one another through the storm. And that is the message this story wants to leave behind. That a person's worth has never been found in the blood running through their veins or the money in their pocket, but in the way they treat others in the moments when no one is watching. That a hand reaching out in the cold night can light up an entire life, and that a true family is the place where people are chosen, held close, and loved without condition. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with the people you love. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can welcome many more meaningful stories together every day. How do you feel about Hollis and Sully's journey? And what part of the story moved you the most? Please leave a few lines in the comments so we can hear the honest emotions from deep within your heart. Thank you for listening until the very final moments. May you and the people you love always be blessed with abundant health, live in peace, and find joy in each passing day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.